Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this is the podcast for you. Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today, Ayden and I are talking about another one of our favorite rut topics, and that is roaring red stags. If you guys missed last week's episode, we did a deep dive on all things fallow deer. We spoke about the biology of fallow deer, factors that may affect the rutting activity of fallow deer, and also our favorite tips and tactics for hunting fallow deer. We did a complete breakdown, and we're super happy to get that out to you guys. So make sure you guys go back and check that out if you haven't already. This week, we're going to do something similar with red deer. So we're going to break down the biology, which is very similar. We're then going to go into some tips and tactics on how to be successful with red deer. So without further ado, we'll jump into the podcast.
So one of the key fundamentals, they obviously rut at very similar times of the year, but there are some vast differences between fallow deer and red deer. So the initial one that you'll obviously know when looking at them is their just body size. But then there are so many different things. The timing, as we said, can be quite similar, both being in March, April. But red deer, as a tendency, typically tend to be a couple of weeks earlier than fallow deer, especially when it comes to their peak rut. Is quite often towards the end of March, very early April, if not earlier in March in some instances. Another key difference is that red deer wallow, very similar to a pig or a rooster deer stag or a sambar deer stag. They do actually quite, in fact, like water sources, which can be a strategy for hunting them at this time of the year as well.
Another thing is reds are very much more subjective to hunting pressures. So with fallow deer, especially if you're hunting a buck or a couple of does on a scrape, he may give you a couple of chances to bust him before he'll sort of change his behavior. And you may notice that he's less vocal, for example, croaking or whatnot, before he sort of moves to a different part of the hill. Red stags very much, and especially hinds, are a lot more clued in from our experiences. And if you scare a red stag or the hinds, it's nothing for them to move to almost like a completely different suburb. Like they will, if you've only got a small block, you may notice that they completely move out of and off your block. But equally, like if you've got quite a large parcel of land, it's nothing for them to move to a completely different mountain or different part of the mountain range, talking to up to kilometers. So it obviously takes into account one of the tactics that we're going to discuss later on, but you really sort of want to capitalize every opportunity that you have with a red stag, because it may be your one and done opportunity, because they certainly are more susceptible to hunting pressure.
There's a key point here, like obviously fallow bucks are very territorial and occupying a scrape, and they've put in so many resources into building that up, often in the pre-rut in March, going through until April, where they're obviously trying to bring girls to their sort of bachelor pad, if you will. So they've obviously got a lot invested in that patch of turf, whereas a red stag, like for him, he does want to return quite often to a particular property or particular rutting area, often the same, bench or sort of valley that he knows and the hinds are in, because that's the thing is he's moving to the hinds. He doesn't have any dedication to a patch of ground. So the second there's any hunting pressure or any variables from year to year, he's just going to move and take his girls with him, which is very much a key difference between fallow and reds. Another thing with last week's podcast on fallow deer is that we spoke about doe selection. In this instance with the hinds, it's not dictated at all. Like the hinds will definitely go towards a red stag, but the stags are very much like the shepherd when it comes to a shepherd and their sheep. Like he's controlling his harem. He's trying to dictate them and move them to where he wants to go. He's taking them and rounding them up from other lesser stags and rival stags that are in the area. A hind will, if they're not liking that stag or not wanting to go to that particular area, you'll see them quite readily, very similar to elk almost in a way, where they'll bust and break out of that little harem and that mob and run away. And you'll see the stag sort of do a big cut, try and bring them back to the mob. And at the same time, there could be other stags then using that as an opportunity to run in and cause more chaos and disarray and things like that. So whilst fallow deer often will occupy a scrape, and we talked about that bait ball last week where there's a heightened activity in the center of that scrape, and then it sort of slowly peels out and becomes less and less deer. A red stag might be running 150 meters rounding up a hind and then roaring and calling, to the lesser stag saying, piss off, get out of my area, run back up the hill 100 meters, grab that hind that's sort of wandering off with a yearling, and just trying to keep them all in tow until he can get to a spot where obviously he's satisfied that the rival stags have kept their distance and he can sort of funnel them to where he wants to be. Because they often, early mornings you'll catch them in the open, especially the hinds might be feeding and things. Like they'll try and go about their normal patterns and behavior. And that red stag's trying to get them to a place where he can defend them.
Yeah, that's the main difference. Like a doe will choose a buck, whereas a stag will control a harem of hinds. And like Ayden was saying, because they're not tied down to us, like they're not tied to the scrape where a buck would mate a doe, for example, that stag then can push his hinds and his harem to whatever tiny little secluded pocket he can find. And that's where it also like impacts vocalization, that type of stuff. Like it's nothing for those big old stags to have these tiny little, a tiny little thick gully where he pushes his girls to very early on in the rut. He's controlling quite a large number of hinds and he does very little vocalization and he just like holds his girls hoping that no one finds him. As opposed to bucks are obviously very chauvinistic almost and very vocal. So they'll be, on an open bench, high up on a ridge, croaking their ass out, trying to attract girls, trying to, scare off rival bucks and whatnot. Whereas a stag, is almost a lot more secretive in some ways, especially the big old mature ones. And they'll just happily hold the girls and not sort of outwards display their presence and stuff like that, because then they obviously, encourage competition.
Another factor here where I don't know if it's necessarily a key difference, but similar to that nature where the red stags are running around so much and occupying like a larger area, when they do get their chance to take a bit of a break, they often will, especially if it's in thicker cover during the middle of the day, seem to bed down a lot more. Whereas a fallow buck, like a lot of the time, will be up nudging does. You see them like refreshing their scrapes. They're almost like more active because they're on a defined sort of area. They're not necessarily bedding down as much. Whereas, yeah, once that stag gets his harem of hinds back to safety, like he'll quite readily bed down. Venture Hunting Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer. Venture started from a team of passionate hunters with the mission to give Australian hunters the resource they deserve. Through community events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store, it's a community. Check out their incredible megastore in Brisbane today, or head to their website to shop all things hunting and outdoors. Alrighty, so on last week's podcast, Fallow Rut Tactics, we dived into factors that affect the female estrus cycle. We did basically a biology lesson there where we were pretty in depth. For today's purpose, just because we've already discussed this with fallow deer, we'll simply list them today as they're quite similar and relate very similarly to the red deer hinds. But those factors that are most important include photoperiod or the shortening of day length. As we described last week, that's pretty much the most pivotal. That's what sets the rut into motion. We also then get things like the stag presence when they come back from their velveting grounds, and we get that pre-synchronization of the hinds, essentially, which means like there are now males on the scene starting to show up on the same ridges and valleys, and that kicks the girls into these silent heats. We also have body condition scores and nutrition of both of the hinds and the stags. And talking about similarly to last week, where these animals are basically athletes. They're going into, a major event, which is the rut or the raw, and they need to be in suitable body condition score and have, the right nutrition to last that period. We also touched on environmental factors and conditions, things like a harsh winter and minimal food and food scarcity going into these seasons can be a thing. Same as harsh summers. Late ruts from the previous year or late raws, and larger fawns than normal, as well as drought, rainfall, moon phase. All these sorts of things can affect the rut or raw. One thing that we didn't really touch on last week was female maturity, so the age of the does or the age of the hinds. It's important, probably more so in red deers, just because they're like a larger animal, larger than the does. But it's said that the prime breeding age for a hind is about 3 to 7 years old, with a hind over 10 years of age being quite mature, past her prime breeding, and a hind less than 2 years old being young and inexperienced, with essentially less likely to conceive on their first go, which may result in delayed conception, and that's why we might see these animals getting bred in later April, early May, things like that, in second and third estrus cycles.
Similarly to fallow deer, the pre-rut and pre-raw period, we see the dropping of antlers sort of September period, which then follows through to them growing their antlers or growing their velvet all the way through February. So as you can imagine, a mature red stag may have over 40 inches of antlers with more than 6 points. That would be an incredible trophy and hopefully something I plan to bump into one day. But that is a lot of tissue that they need to grow in a very short period of time. So they might be growing 2 or 3 centimeters a day. As you can imagine, that then requires a huge nutritional amount. And that means that they're going to be targeting those fresh green picks. So especially protein in the way of clover or potentially on crops. And that's what mainly gets them in trouble. And they can get quite heavily sort of hunted during this velvet period by farmers and shooters because they're often found on crops in quite high numbers. Blackberry bushes and thistles can also be good energy sources, especially in that autumn period, as the blackberries are very high in energy. But red stags, because of this nutritional demand, may travel more than typically a fallow buck. So it's nothing for a red stag to be 10, 20, 30, maybe even more kilometers away from where they're actually going to be rutting. So once they start stripping out their antlers in that sort of late January, early February period, they then start the big migration, I guess, back to where they're going to be rutting. And they can cover country quite quickly. So if you're finding red stags during that period, it really is sort of a one and done in terms of that opportunity that you're going to get on them. Because most likely, if you see a red stag, especially in that February, March period, while he's transitioning, it's most likely you're going to see him. And if you're not back there, even by the next morning or that afternoon, he could be kilometers away because they do get on a march and it is documented they will just move through a valley or through a valley system. So if you do see a stag during this period, you really want to try and capitalize. The hard thing is there's not really a huge amount in terms of tips and tactics during this period. Like it is mainly just going to be spot and stalk. If you're trying to target stags in this period, then using glass and getting up on a high vantage point to try and locate them is going to be your best friend and best asset. But once you've actually found that stag, then it's just going to be a common spot and stalk to get in there. Like hind calling or thrashing bushes or roaring isn't really going to do much because they are still just very much focused on nutrition and getting back to their running areas.
Next, we might dive into what red stags are most known for, and that is definitely their majestic sort of roaring. It can be said that their roaring is like obviously very guttural. It comes from sort of deep within, and everyone can sort of envisage that red stag that's roaring on a hilltop, and there's steam and foam coming out of his mouth as a mob of hinds sort of stands behind him on the hill there. I think it's best been described as some sort of a mix between a domestic cow and then like a lion's roar. We'll have to try and add one into this podcast here as like a sound effect or something like that. But for those that haven't heard it in the flesh, it's pretty amazing. It definitely goes through you a little bit. And it's funny, like I've actually heard a red stag roar plenty of times and then been on properties where there are cows and you hear that sound that's quite similar and you go, was that a red stag? And you're not quite sure. And then the red stag calls and you're like, no, it's completely different to a cow. But you can sort of be tricked into definitely like thinking that you've heard one, especially if you're moving through the scrub and there's like ambient noise. But if you're sitting on a hilltop early in the morning and a red stag roars, it's hard to sort of mistake it.
Now, the two big factors that I always think about when I'm trying to roar in red stags are the two T's, so timing and tone. So I'll use an analogy to try and help illustrate the point. And so imagine you're at a family brunch at 11 a.m. on a Sunday afternoon. You're with your granny, you're with your aunties, you're with your family, and you're not going to be very vocal and sort of antagonistic I mean, that can happen and it can escalate to that, but generally it's very sort of mild environment. And that's what we often see hunters make mistake in. Similarly, at 11 o'clock when there's not much activity and not much happening, you see people do these like ridiculously guttural roars. And I've seen it on places where I've like hunted with other hunters and, the activity is quite low. There's not really much happening. Normally by then the stag's roaring. And so someone's location roar, which we'll discuss in a second, is a 10 out of 10. Like they've gone straight to a, I'm going to come and, attack you across the table type thing, and that's where the tone of it comes in and is so important. Whereas most of the time you can escalate to something like that and I'll switch it up to just say 2 a.m. in a nightclub scene. Well, yeah, that is when most of the activity and fighting and that type of thing is going to happen. And so you're trying to match what you're seeing, or more specifically what you're hearing, to the roars that you're doing. So most of the time I'll actually just do, and these tips and tactics that, like if you listen to a podcast, like so Remy Warren's got there's a heap of people that have them for calling an elk. It's very similar. Like what you're trying to implicate is like, you're trying to say, what message am I actually displaying to that stag that's sitting, or that potential stag that's sitting across the valley? So when I talk about timing, the big one with that is the time between roars. So just say, it's 6 a.m. in the morning and there's no stags roaring, and then I do a location roar, which is very flat, monotone. I'll do one now for you guys. Oh. So it's not really super, and it's sort of hard to do this here, so that may not sound the best, sorry, but it's quite a flat, like it's not really intimidating. It's more of just like, hey guys, displaying it out, but you're not sort of being super aggressive. It's just like, I'm over here, this is what I'm doing. And then the big thing with timing is actually working out, like, so I'll look at my watch and just say it's 6 a.m. in the morning, and I'll see how long it takes for a stag to hopefully call back and roar at me. So just say it's 8:05 when it roars back. So I think another common mistake that people make is they will immediately then roar back at the stag. Whereas what you're trying to do is you're trying to like amp up the activity. So normally I'll just wait 2 or 3 minutes and then I'll do another roar that matches what his roar was. So he might straight away, it's probably unlikely, but he may straight away go to like a super aggressive roar to almost say like piss off or whatever, and be a bit defensive. But most of the time he'll just give a similar roar to what you've sort of put out there. So then he roared 5 minutes later. I'll then roar with a similar tone, maybe slightly more aggressive, and I'll take down a little bit time. So I might do it at 8:09, for example, 8:08, 6:08 or 6:09, so a couple of minutes later. And then what you'll notice is you can start to sort of understand what type of mood, I guess, that stag is in. And like, not to say that, going back to the family brunch analogy, not to say that there can't be a full-on brawl at 11 o'clock in the morning, but it's like it generally doesn't escalate that quickly to that. It takes more time. And so with the timing part, you're trying to cut that time down and get that stag really sort of pumped up and fired up. But you've got to almost do this like song and dance and sort of be a bit, I don't know, like convince them that you're a threat. And that may be by moving closer, or it may be by shortening the time, or it may be by increasing the aggressiveness of the tone. But what you're trying to do is get that stag worked up, because then he's going to come potentially to you, which, if he's got girls, isn't very likely. He's more likely to probably try and push the girls away from you. But it may mean that he's amped up and he keeps calling, and then that gives you a chance to slip in while he's still roaring and stuff like that. And then you can use other tactics like hind calls, or you may force him to try and come in to you if you close enough ground. But going back to the timing part, like I said, you're trying to shorten that time period and you're trying to increase the tone or the aggression of your roar in sequence. When you get him fully worked up and he starts doing that guttural roar and he starts going, those type of things. So it's not to say that you can't do it back to him, but I guess there is implications when you've sort of got it to that level. So when you're actually roaring, it's probably more likely that you draw in like younger stags to come in and check you out than you are to like pull a really dominant, mature stag to your location. If he's got hinds, he's more likely to be defensive unless you like really get in close and then force him to commit to your roar to like defend you. Whereas if you just want to shoot any old, any stag as your first stag, or you want to get a stag for meat or whatever, then roaring is obviously a really good tactic.
Hunt and Fall is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of memberships to get you on your next adventure. Whether it be an annual trip or once in a lifetime adventure, Hunt and Fall and the consultancy team will cater to your needs. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually immediately, James reaped the rewards when he drew a coveted limited entry elk tag. James would not have known about the opportunity, let alone ever applied for this unit, and therefore, without the assistance of our friends at Hunt and Fall, a hunt like this would not have been achievable. If you're interested in using Hunting Fool's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then please email applications@huntandfool.com and mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Hunt and Fool team will take care of it from there. I can definitely attest to that with the younger stags. Like I can tell you, I've called in plenty of young stags with a roar, whereas I've never called in a large mature stag. Personally, I've had more luck with that, with like hind calling, for example. I think it's just a lot more specific, and again, like they're not necessarily looking for a fight. Like they know they're the king of the hill, so they're sort of like, unless they think that there's a stag over there occupying hinds, why would they leave potentially their hinds? Like, and if you think of the dominant stag or as a really mature stag, they've probably worked out where the hinds are. That's what they're there for. They're probably holding them. If you can get them to roar back by doing one of those location roars, then that's all good and well. What we'll talk about in a moment is actually like a silent approach from once you sort of get another deer talking back to you. Again, like I'll often use timing, as James was alluding to there. And if I've got a stag that's really, really keen, like I let out a, monotone sort of call as a bit of a location roar, and then I get a stag like absolutely roaring back. And similar to what James was saying with timing, I actually use like the timing and interval between when the stag's roaring as something that's important, but also like the movement of stags between their roars, which like can be almost like a meterage. So if you hear a stag roar at point A and then 30 seconds later he's at point B and that's 50 meters from where he first called at point A, I'm not too impressed. Whereas if you hear him call at point A and then, 30 seconds to a minute later he's at point B, which is 500 meters away and closer to you, that's a lot more interesting to me because that's a stag that's actively moving. And that's where, again, most of the time, it's probably a younger stag that's sort of a satellite stag looking for a bit of trouble, looking for a stag that's occupying does because he's traveling a ridge or a valley system looking for girls. That's why he's looking and calling and things like that. But there is the case that it is a dominant stag that's, been kicked off girls, hasn't quite found him if it's early in the rut. But again, that movement between roars and that time interval can be really important in sort of showing you what's likely to occur, because that stag that's moving and having roars every couple of minutes is going to be a lot more callable than a stag that calls every 15, 20 minutes to half an hour and doesn't move at all.
One thing to keep in mind too with the is he moving or is he not moving is just their head position. So like whether they're roaring towards you or whether they turn 180 degrees and roar away from you because he might have like looked back and be looking at his hinds that are walking off in the other direction or something like that, can completely change how like the volume, like how loud it actually seems to you. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, because you may think that a stag's only 100 or 150 meters away, that you can't see, and you think that he's moved away 100 meters since his last roar, but it may literally just be that he's turned and looked the other way and has roared. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, because I know personally I've pushed up onto stags that I think has moved, started moving away. So you've gone to almost like chase them up the hill, and they actually haven't. They must have been facing the other way, or obviously how much they're putting into their roar. So they equally like our voice, you can scream or you can just talk, with a normal volume voice. So just a few things to take into account, because obviously, you don't want to be pushing up too quickly, especially if he's got hinds that may bust you.
In addition to all this chat about roaring, it is said that in theory, like the larger stags will have a sort of more aggressive, deeper vocalization, and that's often due to like their larger necks and their vocal cords and things like that. However, this is very much just a theory, because often, as many hunters will detest, Sometimes the pissy little half-assed roars that you hear in the valley are often the most mature stags in the gully. For whatever reason, he might just, as James said, had, been running around chasing and breeding hinds all evening or all night. And then first thing in the morning, he can't really be bothered, and he just lets out a little sort of moan rather than a roar. And so it's definitely worth, when it comes to roaring, if you can get up high with a little bit of elevation and look down into valleys and these areas and try and get eyes on red stags if they're roaring. Like it's one of those things that it's such a blessing if you've got 5 stags in the valley below you roaring at first light, but it's also which one do you sort of go to? And often the wind's going to dictate that. But I think that's going to, sort of lead us towards our next little topic, which is early starts and locating roaring red stags.
This is sort of jumping into a hunt, how we sort of go about actually hunting stags. And so Aiden and I are very much, we get up as early as we can. And sometimes, like as we'll discuss in future podcasts, the best way to find stags obviously is roaring because the density is normally significantly less than fallow deer, for example, even on good places. And so with roaring, they're really giving away their position. And if for some reason during the rut, you're not hearing the roars that you anticipated, there's been ruts where I'll go out at like 1, 2 in the morning to try and find, especially on like large parcels of lands, and just sit there in the dark 15, 20 minutes, let out some roars and try and like find where the stags are at the time or where like the running activity is, especially if there's not many deer and they're moving around a lot. But certainly if it's a good population deer and they are fairly vocal, if it's getting light at 5:30, just say 6 o'clock, I'll be on the mountain at like 4:30. If not, like if I'm up there at 5 o'clock, in my opinion, I'm running late. And that's because I find that period just before first light to be one of the, like stags will roar a lot, but then just as the sun sort of crests the hill, I've noticed that they'll sort of shut up for a period, and it can go 2 ways. Like they can continue going forward, but especially on those mornings where I've been up on the mountain like super early, there might be 3, 4, 5 stags roaring, and then if it's before light, and then but as it transitions and starts getting light, a lot of them sort of just drop off and stop, and then you might go from having 5 stags roaring to having 2 stags roaring. But at least then, if as soon as the light comes up, if you know that one's and you've been on the place before and you know the topography of the mountains and stuff like that, well, you're like, okay, well, stag A was on that ridge, stag B, that one, that one, that one. And then at first light, you can start frantically glassing around to try and like see who, each stag was. Because I personally, I think it's quite hard, like off a stag's roar to actually figure out like how good it is. Like I've seen the best stags in the world, or the best stags I've ever seen, do quite girly, wimpy roars. And then 2 seconds later, they're coming out with like a really guttural roar. And equally, I've seen like some of the stags that I've stalked in the thick bush that you would just think like that is going to be like an absolute beast. Like, this huge red stag, and you get in there, it's just like the ugliest little wimpy stag you've ever seen doing like full on crazy guttural roars. So I just treat every single roar with the respect that it deserves, I guess. And like, so the biggest thing is I always try and get eyes on them. When you're up there at first light, like if there's stags making noise, I genuinely don't give away my location. I would just sort of observe, because you can't, like, obviously with a bow, you can't shoot them across the ridges. With a rifle, you can. But yeah, so there's no point giving away my location. Whereas if there's nothing making noise, that's when I'll do like a location roar to try and sort of spark up something and see what's happening. But generally I'm getting to the highest ridge in the dark, sitting there, trying to locate where they are and then get eyes on stags. And then once I've found the best stag that I can, at very, very first light, then I'm moving in and making my approach towards them.
Once you do locate a stag that is in fact roaring, and it might only be, as James said, that first roar of the morning and then he goes quiet, at least you've got a sort of a beacon to sort of go to. And you'll sort of quickly, once you've hunted red stags, work out, is it 100 meters away, 400 meters away, 500 meters away? Like their voice can really carry in certain situations as well. So we will often, as James said, do like a silent approach, cut the distance down, wait and listen, try and get up to a ridge and glass into where we think they are, especially if it's on the same ridge or like a bench or a gully system. If you don't hear that stag roar and you're still not certain, it is best to probably let out another roar, like again, that monotone location roar. The thing there is you don't want to go too high in your tone and sort of be pushing that stag away, because the last thing you want to do is let him think that he's got serious competition coming. Whereas sometimes, and you notice it with like the bull elk that we were hunting in Montana a couple of years ago. Often one roar will sort of do that cascade signal, and you'll get a second stag, third stag, fourth stag, and they'll all start roaring or bugling depending whatever species it is. And if you can get then that's great, because again, you just go silent and sort of stealthy and start approaching. Some other considerations is like to obviously think about as you're going in on this stag, and hopefully, like, he does let out that roar, again, interval and timing wise, 15 minutes later, and then you've got somewhere to sort of work in towards, and you're going, okay, I'm now 200 meters from this stag. I should be able to start seeing him or hopefully some hinds. Like, are there hinds? Is he a solo stag? If he's a solo stag, in my opinion, he's more likely to be moving. It doesn't say that he won't. With hinds, they'll often move again because the hinds just want to get to wherever they want to go to, and he'll be trying to round them up. But if that stag's like moving one way and then you hear him roar and then he's moving a different way, and it's like he might either be on the scent of a fresh hind or just traveling himself. Like there's nothing sort of holding him in an area. Whereas if there's a stag roaring from the same spot, it's probably more likely that he does have hinds there. He's protective of those hinds, and they're like occupying his attention.
Once I've actually found a roaring stag and decided that's the stag I want to shoot, the next thing that I'm going to be doing is cutting the distance as fast as I can. So most of the time, obviously, reds can vocalize into a valley system a lot more than a fallow buck. So it can be like a kilometer or over a kilometer away that you're hearing a red. So if you get eyes on one up on a bench, just say at first light, and he's a kilometer away, I am then, and this is where fitness comes in, and hence, you're listening to this podcast still well before the rut. So make sure you're doing your Ks and dues for the rut. But that's where I am like full on busting ass. And generally speaking, I will be like running towards that stag, because there's no guarantees. Like the longer it goes on in the morning, the more likely he is to start moving off from where I last saw him, and the more likely he is to shut up and stop vocalizing. And there's nothing better than you moving in on a stag and he's doing all the work and saying, hey, 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 I'm over here. So if just say he's 600 meters away for this story, I'm sprinting in and trying to get eyes on him again, and potentially his does at probably about 150 to 200 meters away. The biggest thing to assess is what time of the morning is it. So am I coming in, are the thermals, am I expecting that the thermal's going to be sucking up? Am I expecting the thermal's going to be sucking down? Generally speaking, I don't really like coming in from below red deer. I find it quite difficult. So if the thermals are sucking down, I'm generally going to try and come in level with him and the mob. Whereas if the thermals are sucking up, then similarly, I'm probably going to come in from either above him or level with him. I just find that I get, like, from all the times I've ever come in below red deer, I've always just found like I've just got pinned, I guess, and it's quite hard to move up on them. But generally what I'm trying to do is just cut that distance to about the 150, assess if he's got hinds or if he doesn't have hinds. If he's got hinds, then I'll probably try and if he's been harassed by other stags or something like that, generally speaking, I'll try similar to what we said with the fallow buck, where I'll probably try to get into roughly 50 meters from them and do a hind call to bring the stag towards me to come and check me out. Like, who's this new hind, or who's this hind that I've left behind that potentially one of these other stags might pick up and steal away. Equally though, if I see that a stag doesn't have hinds, or I don't think he's got hinds, then I may try doing a hind call from further away. So I've had a lot of success bringing solo stags. Like, sometimes they're mature, sometimes they're not. From distances, like I've hind called stags in over like 400 or 500 meters with just hind calls, like across gullies and stuff like that. They will travel, like it. Firstly, the hind call goes a long way, but secondly, like, they will travel, and also it's probably an important note, they will travel quickly to a hind call. It's incredible how fast sometimes a red stag can cover country. But yeah, that is probably the tactic I use the most in terms of hind calls, because they're just desperate. It's not like the does are going to the bucks. The stags generally go to the hinds and then they hold the hinds. So using that advantage, using that to our advantage, like, they're generally going to come and check you out. But it's also feeling out the stag. Like, there's been plenty of stags where I've hind called and, the stag roars to almost encourage me to say, hey, come towards me, come to me and stuff. And you hind call and he roars back, and you hind call and he comes back. But he's normally, in that sense, he's got hinds, and that's where it's like, I'm not prepared to leave 5 hinds to go and see this rogue hind that's 100 meters away. And that's where I find getting in a bit closer to that 50 meters or even 40 meters sometimes. He might be in thick brush or whatever, and doing that hind call, it's a lot less intimidating, or it's a lot easier for him to just walk 40 or 50 meters to go and check out this new random hind than it is for him to have to leave his girls unguarded and susceptible to being stolen by other stags to walk 150 meters. And that's why it's really critical to try and weigh up, well, can you see if he's got hinds, or do you think he has hinds, into how close you're going to be getting. But that's definitely the tip and tactic that I've used, plenty of times to get stags of all different sort of maturities and levels well and truly into bow range, and makes for an absolutely exciting hunt.
I think you just touched on so many different topics there that, I just want to add little bits of intel to as well. Like, for example, if you call it a stag and you know that he's with hinds, like there's so many factors that are going to influence his next move. So if you do a hind call and that stag just sort of looks your way and then turns back to his 5 hinds, I wouldn't bother doing a hind call again for the next little while. Like, he's obviously going, I've got my girls, I'm content. Whereas if you do a hind call and he turns on a dime and starts walking towards you, that's where you follow it up with a second and a third potentially. And with hind calls, the higher you go with that vocalization and that pitch, the more excited and more estrus like it's going to be, like, of a hind call. And again, calling any species is going to vary a lot, especially when you consider like topography. So if you're calling at a red stag and you've got to the edge of like where he can see you, and potentially some of his hinds have just drifted your way and you call, there's a lot more likelihood that that stag's going to come and investigate. Or same as if you've been roaring back and forth with the stag, and just as he's about to crest a hill and go over, you can get to where he sort of just was and call, or do a hind call, like do a roar, or do a hind call. He's going to accept that challenge a lot more than if he can see 100 meters down the hill. And especially that's where James was talking earlier about whether you come in from the same elevation above or below. I don't want to offend people here that hunt red deer regularly, but like, it is quite similar that we notice reds and elk are very different species, obviously, but there are some similarities. And similar to elk, and like this is where they again differ from the fallow, which are occupying that space, the reds often will feed down lower, I find, and then try and be getting up to their bedding areas in the ridges and up a bit higher. So that's where sometimes, as James was sort of speaking to, it's very difficult to be following the tail of them behind and coming up from the bottom. Whereas if you can loop around, sort of appreciate where they're trying to get to that spot, get the thermals right, because it's often sort of just the sun's hitting the hills and sucking up, and then come down. And if you can be imitating a red stag's like roars when you get closer, or a red hind's hind calls, as that stag's hinds are moving up towards your position naturally, it's just going to give that stag that much more like momentum and incentive to go and check it out, to go and put himself between that rival stag, or put himself over that hind, bring her back to his harem. Whereas if he has to sort of go back over where he's just been, especially if it tends to be downhill, they won't do that. Whereas they don't like giving up that higher ground to another stag in like, especially.
The other idea is, once you've got into that 150 to 50 depending area, is whether you roar or not. So I personally would rather not, because and we're just trying to just cover all bases and discuss all options here, but I find that especially at 150, like, there is no way that I would roar at a stag at, generally speaking, at 150 unless he's moving towards me. Because if you're roaring at a stag at 150 meters, it just gives him that opportunity to round up his harem and start pushing them away. And it's incredible how fast they can cover country, like I was alluding to before. Whereas if you're at that 50-meter range, then you sort of put the stag into a bit of a hard situation, in the sense that you can roar and you're so close that it's like, now it's a direct threat. Like, it's like, no, like, I'm not across the gully. Like, you need to come and address me right now. And so that's where getting in really close, especially like what I'll actually do is I'll normally do a hind call first and just see his sort of, feel him out and see what he's doing, because it's a lot easier if you can just get him in with a hind call. Whereas, if he's pinned in a spot, then doing a roar can work to try and sort of put the pressure on him and make him come and address you, I guess, as this potential new stag that's in the area and going to come and steal his girls. But it does always carry the risk. Like, I have multiple times had stags, even at that close range, just go and bail out, and start covering country. Especially like it's a lot harder if they're in thicker bush and they've got 10 hinds. But it certainly has happened to me. And that's why I generally speaking sort of edge more towards caution, and try and use hind calls because it's a lot less aggressive. Um, Not to say that I haven't roared, and had stags come in. I mean, I've never actually shot a stag doing it. I've had stags come in and not be able to get shots away because generally it's like in really, really thick bush or dogwood or whatever. But yeah, I've probably had as many times, even at 50 meters, the stags just run the opposite direction.
And like I love an analogy, so I'll try and give a bad one here. But what James was just explaining there, like if you've got someone messaging on Facebook saying, "Hey mate, I hate you, I want to fight. Come to my house now or meet me there," you're not very inclined to go and meet him and fight. Whereas if you're at a bar and you've got your girl there, for example, and some bloke comes up and stands at your table and says, you know, stand up, I want to fight. You kind of, you're threatened. You kind of going, shit, my partner is like, there's obviously bystanders. Yeah, you're forced into a situation. And it's funny because even if you're roaring at a stag there at 40 or 50 meters, they can de escalate that situation. Like you're obviously calling them out, but they can just go, come on, baby, like we're leaving. Don't even like entertain this guy. And they can leave the bar. So you can sort of still end up with like egg on your face, I guess. But it's just much more likely. Like if you're sending messages to someone saying, I want to fight, you don't really take it seriously. And that's where that distance component really comes in. Whereas if someone rocks up on your front doorstep or the bar in this analogy, I appreciate that it's a terrible analogy. I will do better. But it does paint the picture that, you're forced into, oh, geez, this guy is right there. It's fight or flight very quickly. Whereas, if there's distance component and it's further away, it's more likely to just be flight and keep going about your business. OzCaff Energy helps you power your passion. Designed to be convenient, discreet, and portable with rapid energy absorption. These caffeine pouches are centered around adventure. With added benefits such as 0 calories and 0 sugar, what's not to love? Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order. I guess with all this discussion about, calling in deer and either hind calling or roaring in a red stag, we would be negligent if we didn't talk about shot placement, especially as red deer are such giant animals. Like a male or a big stag can weigh as much as 300 kilograms, with the average probably being closer to that 200 to 250, which is still just a massive animal. You got to think about, an animal that stands up to 1.5 meters high at the shoulder. When you're talking about an animal like that or any animal that you're planning on bow hunting or rifle hunting, you obviously want to know the anatomy, but it just becomes so much more important when you're talking about front-on shots or quartering-on shots, when animals are basically being called in and they've gone from being relaxed and sort of doing their behavior of, either feeding and sort of, milling around, traveling, to coming into a very particular spot or a very particular source where they're anticipating either confrontation if it's a stag or, breeding and the anticipation that's associated with the lustfulness of being, attracted to a hind call. So these animals are definitely heightened and anticipating something to happen, which means that there's more chances that they're going to react to the shot, duck and turn, all these sorts of things, which again, like only increase the level of error that could occur with these sorts of shots. So in saying that, I'm a massive advocate for a front on shot if it's, very close range. And especially like if you're an experienced hunter and you've done it before, I'd nearly honestly say a front on shot with a bow is probably nearly more lethal than a rifle, just because with rifles, you're opting for that percussion effect. And unless you're shooting them in the neck, the base of the neck or something like that, you've got a lot more bone and things like that to contend with. Whereas with the archery gear, it's almost like it works or it doesn't work. It's that simple. If you can, and again, you're shooting at a tennis ball sized target zone on a front on shot, even on the animal like as large as a red deer. Whereas when they turn broadside, it's almost like a football sized, lung field and heart zone. Like it's a lot bigger, sort of, and it all depends on that shot angle. Same as if it's quartering away. But again, we've elected to call and this animal's coming in front on. So now we're working with a tennis ball. And what you've got to sort of acknowledge is that you've got all this bone there. So not only do you have like the neck and the muscle and the vertebrae of the neck, but you've also got the sternum down sort of lower and more centrally. Depending on if it's quartering on and not dead straight, you've also got like things like the scapula and the scapular spine and the ridge and that type of stuff, which can obviously deflect an arrow and pull up a gunshot as well, I guess. But to be honest, with a rifle, you're probably not taking shots at 7 meters and things like that. You probably would have waited to shoot them, from 50 or 100 or whatever you may have been. So this is probably more relevant to the archers and the bow hunters. But one of the good things, if you do get it right and you go through that sort of sweet spot, just above the sternum there, at the base of the neck, there are so many arteries, whether it's the jugular, carotid, the brachiocephalic, which is the brachiocephalic connects like the head and the forelimbs. And again, these are all sort of major blood vessels, especially in an animal that big. If you do hit them on entry, they can cause quite a lot of blood to obviously hemorrhage from that animal. But where you're trying to get it is through the heart and lungs. And that's where, if you see your arrow like disappear through the center of that animal and take out the top of the heart or lungs, normally it's you might not get a blood trail sometimes if it's missed those jugular or carotids, but you'll often hear the animal run a short distance and start crashing because it's so fatal. If you haven't heard that animal run, within 100 meters and crash, and again, they're a big animal, they're running at full tilt because they're anticipating danger, they're being smacked in the face, and then they're running off going, holy shit, I was not expecting that, and eventually succumbing to a fatal shot. If you don't hear that, I'd be a little bit more worried and skeptical that potentially it hasn't gone correctly. And that's where the worst thing you can do is follow that animal up really quickly and try and, get a second shot in, or just, let your nerves come into play and try and follow it. What I would do is get your phone out straight away, mark where you are, where you've taken the shot, take a photo of what's in front of you. We'll discuss all of this in future blood trailing episodes and just tactics for that type of stuff. But again, you hear about it quite often with reds and fallow, and we probably should have spoken a bit more about it last week with shot placement on deer and stuff that are coming in front on, but it can go wrong so quickly. So again, unless you see that animal, run a short distance and fall over, ideally in sight, or hear it crash within a short distance, just give it at least half an hour, because the worst thing you can do on an animal like that that's sort of already heightened because of the rut and that is push in on it, especially like if there's not much of a blood trail. But again, these animals, if you do nick one of those arteries, are most likely going to bleed out. You just don't want to give them the adrenaline to travel to another ridge or, suburb, as James said earlier, and disappear, because they are most likely dead on their feet. If it goes badly and you've hit, it hasn't entered the chest cavity and it's deflected off bone, then sometimes you will get good blood trails. It will often be like a really bright red, like arterial sort of blood. But those animals, it's similar to if they're getting a tine or something from like another stag or a buck, they'll often be sore and things like that, but they can survive. And in fact, like a broadhead is often sharper, so a bit of a neater sort of cut than some of these tines, which can obviously go in and cause massive like muscle damage and things like that. Not saying it's obviously, advantageous or anything like that for the deer, but they can sometimes survive that.
One thing to note is, like, someone said to me that they would never take a front on shot, but then they were telling me that their favorite shot angle was a quartering away. And I think, like, it was funny to me to hear that, because it's essentially the reverse. Like, a front on shot is a quartering away taken at the opposite angle. So it's, it's important to think of it that way. Like, what you're trying to accomplish is, whenever I'm taking any shot, it's like, okay, well, where is the heart and how can I take that out? So whenever you're taking into account shot angles, that's like the objective. Like, you're taking it so that, generally speaking, if it's like quartering on or quartering away, you're trying to shoot between the front legs, or shoot so that the arrow pops out between the front legs if it's quartering away. But that's sort of what I'm running in my mind when I'm sort of picking the line that I want the arrow to take on that shot. As Ayden said, like, perfectly, I feel like with front on shots, it either goes perfectly, and like Ayden said, I think it can be one of the most ethical shots taken, or it goes wrong. And one of the big factors that you have to play, that has play in this than more than broadside, for example, or quartering away, is because the animal's facing you, and generally it's close quarter, like you're calling them in, like Ayden said. I find that it's more likely for them to jump the string. And so where you may have been previously aiming and done a perfect shot, Well, if that stag drops a foot and then half turns, you're just as likely to hit it through the the back straps, or run it down its ribs, or something like that. In which case, like Ayden summed it up perfectly, where it's like, if you don't really hear a crash, like, I would sort of be a little bit concerned, because there is, like, it's almost, I don't want to say it's all or nothing, but it is something that normally is executed really well, or poorly. And that's where I don't think people should hesitate to take these shots, but when they should hesitate, if they feel like they're not, if the conditions aren't right. And so that's where, like, if you draw back and the stag's walking in, and you've done this perfect sequence and he's coming in on a string, and you get a bit excited and sort of like draw back at 30 meters, and he postures up and squares up and starts looking at you. That's a shot that I'm not inclined to take, like, because the chance that that arrow hits where you're aiming by the time that by the time you shoot is pretty low. Like, I think you're more likely going to wound that stag. Whereas if he's walking in, if you draw back when he's at 30, and then when he puts his head behind a tree like you should do, and then he walks in, and he's at sub 20 meters, and it's whether even it's a quartering on or straight dead on, then that's definitely a shot every day of the week. And that's where, like, using setups that you're really confident with. So, leads into broadheads, like we're both shooting Koga broadheads and love them for that matter, where you're confident that it's going to bust through bone and not break. Whereas using a mechanical broadhead, for that matter, I just wouldn't be confident that it's going to actually penetrate and get into the rib cage, or through the rib cage, or through the scapula. And that's where, you almost may tag these stags, or tag that fallow buck, where, it goes in and the broadhead almost locks up on the bone, and so it doesn't penetrate properly. And hence I said tagged it, because you only get 4 or 6 inches of penetration. It's not to say that, like, continuing on from Ayden said, it's not that you can't get a follow-up shot, but it's just the way that I would go about following up that animal would be a lot more cautious if you didn't hear him crash on a front-on shot, because they're not normally making it over 80 meters. Like, normally it's something where they do like a death sprint and then die. So if you don't hear that, then I would, continue on, like, wait for probably 20 minutes, half an hour, and then have an arrow on the string and really slowly be following him up. Probably expecting him more likely to be alive than be dead, to be honest.
The other thing when following these these blood trails is don't go off, like, the amount of blood, because, as I said earlier, you can hit that brachiocephalic artery, or like subclavian artery or something like that in the front leg, and that animal may bleed basically like someone's dripping a fair bit of, like, squirting water out of or blood out of a water bottle for a kilometer and a half, and these animals will just keep walking. They're like, because a 300 kilo red stag can have 30 liters of blood, for example. Probably a little bit less. I think it's like 8% of
8%, so 24 liters for a 300 kilo animal, and then they can lose, if you look 10% of that easily.
Exactly, and if you look at 1 mil, if someone got a 1 mil syringe and filled that with red food dye and sprayed that over the wall, it would look like what you see in Hollywood movies with murder scenes. Like, so 24 liters of blood. Like, obviously they're not prepared to lose that much. Like, they
acutely,
I think it's like 1% of that blood volume, or 10% of that blood volume is, like, quite drastic. So if they're losing like 2.4 liters, like, they're going to go into basically death.
They're going to go into shock. But the thing is, like what Ayden was alluding to, like, I've hit jugulars before on animals and on front on shots, and it looks so impressive. But it's like, because it's all external. So often when you just say you shoot something broadside, if you've ever, like, cut something and just say it runs 30 meters and dies, if you ever actually do a post-mortem to see where you hit it, a lot of the blood is actually in the cavity, like, it never actually escapes, and you think you've, like, pummeled this boar or buffalo or bison or whatever, but there's not really much on the ground. Like, there's a couple of sprays here and there, and then you open it up and he's got 4 or 5 liters or more in their chest cavity. The same with these, like, red stags. Like, if you hit them through the jugular or one of these arteries in the main legs, it may look really impressive, and it's like drip, 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 splatter, splatter, splatter. If he stands there for a bit, there might be like a pool the size of your palm, just say. But in the grand scheme of things, like, that pool that's the size of your palm might be 5 mils. So if you put that in comparison, it's like, oh, they need to lose 2.4 before they go into shock. It's like, well, water on a duck's back. And so that's where, it's really all in or nothing on these shots. And so choosing when you take these shots is really critical. Don't want to hazard people away from it because, as we've stressed as well, they can be super effective. But it's just making sure that the environment's right and the animals, they're going to be highly strung and they're going to drop. So aiming maybe a little bit lower, but it's just something to take into account when you're calling them in.
I really liked also what you said there about sort of like a quartering on just being the opposite of a quartering away. And I know that in theory, the quartering away is something that we advocate, especially to like archers and bow hunters that are learning and those with like lower poundage. But as James sort of alluded to there, without actually saying it, I think you are picking your entry and your exit on every single shot. So like that's how I look at the animal as like a 3D object. And I'm going, okay, I want to hit point A and have it exit at point B. This is the trajectory and this is where I needed to go to do this. It's incredibly important on uphill and downhill shots as well, because there's no point hitting it perfect on side A just to have it, enter at the top of the spine on point B or something like that. You want it to hit, either lower and the middle or higher and the middle, things like that, because there's just so many considerations when it comes to hunting and calling in animals. And that's where, if you're new to archery and you're thinking, oh, this all sounds like a lot, like it honestly is. And that's where we've been hunting with a bow now for over 25 years. So it's like all this stuff we consider as second nature and things still go wrong. Whereas if you've got a low poundage bow, you've got mechanical broadheads, all these sorts of things, and just say you've shot a few pigs recently, you shot a few deer, even if they're fallow deer, but you haven't been getting, complete pass-throughs where that arrow's punching from side A to side B and exiting the animal, and you're getting a pass through where your arrow's on the other side, I'd be very hesitant to be doing front-on shots on any animal, let alone a big red stag, as we said, because they could be wallowing and have sort of, mud on their brisket all over themselves, which again only increases their armor and their thick matted hair and things like that. And just being such a large animal, we owe it to them to obviously make the most ethical and humane shots on them as possible. But whilst on the topic of armor and wallows and things like that, we might jump into the next topic.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one little thing. We spoke about broadheads and mechanicals, but poundage is probably one thing just to quickly touch on. If you're probably shooting less than, 55 to 60 pound comes to my mind, I'd be very hesitant. And especially like if you're shooting mechanical, I probably just wouldn't even go near a front on shot. Just because of that bone structure. But same thing with a 55 to 60 pound bow. Anything less than that, I probably wouldn't be going front on, just purely worried about penetration. Like you don't have to get it in that far. Like it only has to be, honestly, probably 10 to 12 inches. So not a crazy amount to be like right in there over the top of the heart. But, it's more if you do hit that scapula or you do hit a brisket or you do hit, a bit of bone, like you sort of want that bit of punch where you can like bust through it. And that's where shooting, higher poundages helps because you can obviously get more penetration. That's probably one little thing I just add into that section before we jump into the wallows.
I can hear people saying as well, like, oh, I've shot a 40-pound bow and shot an animal or a 22 bullet and shot a pig in the biggest boar and dropped it. And it's like, we're not denying that, a 40-pound bow with a mechanical broadhead can shoot a red deer stag front on, like 100% definitely can happen. It's just the likeliness and the ratio of successful, perfect ethical kills, which is what we're always striving for, drops dramatically when, your equipment isn't set up for the animal you're pursuing. So if you're like, oh, I'm shooting a rabbit and it's a 10-meter shot and I've got a, rage hypodermic or something like that, I'm going to be like, yep, go for it. If you're saying I'm doing a 30-meter shot front on a red stag that's covered in mud and I've got a 40-pound bow, again, by the time the arrow gets there with a rage hypodermic, it's probably in a different postcode. You're probably going to hit it, in the scapula, probably going to hit it in the sternum, wherever, and it's very unlikely that animal's going to get, the death it deserves.
Yeah, and everyone's seen the video of that young fella in the US who shoots like an incredible elk, where they must have caught it in and it comes walking in through this thick timber, and he shoots it just right in the 10 ring, like in the pocket, in the throat. And it was like he was shooting something like 40 pound. And it buries up like to the fletchers. So you can still see his luminoc. And then he's just sitting there and you can like see the blood pumping out of this. But the thing is, like, he got it like perfectly, and that's where what we're trying to harp on about, like, and obviously being veterinarians, like animal welfare and ethics of hunting is like super important to us. So it's like we don't want to hear about you messaging us and being like, "Hey, took a front on shot, even with a 70-pound bow at a semi-alert stag at like 35 meters, skimmed it across the ribs or lost it or whatever. Like, what do I do?" Like, that's like not really like we're obviously going to help you as much as we can, but I personally sort of don't really like getting those messages because like, well, step one, it's like we probably should have never taken that shot in the first place. And that's what we're trying to sort of educate and teach you guys now. We all know that when it comes to great tasting coffee in the outdoors, you look no further than Dog and Gun Coffee. Their preloaded drip filters are renowned for taking cafe-grade coffee into your hunting camp. But your favourite flavours can also be enjoyed at home with their whole bean variety. Use code TWIN10, that is TWIN, 10 the number, to get $10 off your first order. Check out the range for yourself. We know you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so we were sort of flirting around it there, but red deer in general absolutely love water sources. So in the rut, we can often use wallows as a lesser means of attraction to sometimes find a red stag. But just in general, like farm dams and water systems, especially if they've got wallows in them over the summer months, are some of the best places to do your red deer scouting. So this is again well before the roar takes place. But red deer hinds and fawns over the summer months will go in there and almost like Olympic swimmers be swimming around. There's plenty of people out there with trail cam pictures of, you get the benefit is that dams in summer are going to be a hotspot for all wildlife. So you're going to get your fallow bucks that are there in velvet doing their summer patterns. You're going to get wallowing wild boars, the feral billy goats, red deer as well. But it can be a really good means of working out sort of what's there. Often just knowing sort of how many hinds are in the area if there's no stags, because they might be on the cropping areas and like on the best feed places. But if you've got a property where the red stags don't leave, and that's very possible if there's good enough feed all year round, then you can be tracking these animals as they're coming through their velvet stages and looking at potential, trophy potential for some of these mature stags. But when we talk, and like red deer are very, very social animals. So like the fawns, especially, you'll see if people have got trail cam videos as well. They'll be running around the edges of these dams while the hinds are in there, up to their knees and drinking the water. The red deer fawns will be running around, splashing, playing, and stuff like that. And you see it carry through with spikers, especially young stags, and then the mature stags are probably more there for a bit of a purpose. Often during the rut, if it's a warmer rut. It can be a good strategy during the middle of the day if you know there's a very good wallow system to sit off that. And hopefully, if you've bedded a stag in some thick brush and the wallow system's nearby, he might actually leave those hinds, go down to the wallow, not only to cool down and spread their scent, but sometimes they'll rut up and basically put that armor on, put that mud on. You'll be able to smell them when the wallows are really, really fresh, like they've got this very musky stag sort of smell to them. But a massive tip here would be you might see a red stag that's got mud on him, and if it's like a grey sort of silty black mud, then it's not coming from the red farm dam up on like an exposed ridge. Whereas if he's got that really red red clay sort of mud to him, then I wouldn't be going down to the deep black soil, gully where the wallow or the mud is, that grey colour. So things like that, if you're seeing, a lot of mud in certain places, like, or have seen that stag, it's been hot for a few days, and you see the stag that morning and he's got like some dry mud on him that's a reddish color, I'd be going and sitting off that reddish dam in the lunchtime period, if that makes sense, just because there's a higher likelihood that, they're creatures of habits, he's going to be going back to that one.
Yeah, just my 2 cents on that, and probably adding more to the sort of story I was telling earlier about hunt tactics. So Ayden touched on it. But in the middle of the day, like just say you follow up a red stag, you do the whole song and dance, you roar at him, you call at him, or hind call at him, and he doesn't come in because he's in this thick patch and he's got hinds, and he goes silent or whatever, but you know that he's like in there because every so often he does like a little roar. I would actually, so 2 things, I probably wouldn't, if he's in like really thick bush, where you can't get a shot and you're sort of on the edge of something, that's where I would probably actually just sit and wait, because you can get stags that will, after, everything's cooled down and stuff like that, and they've put their hinds to bed, they may just come to your location where this magical hind being you was and hind calling. So they might like come and check you out. And I'm talking like it might be 15 minutes later. It could be like 2 or 3 hours later. Like they could walk out and like check and be like, oh, I wonder what that. Equally though, if you put a stag to bed and just say you hind call at them and stuff like that, and he roars, but doesn't really commit. That's where, and he's in thick stuff and it's like a warm day. You may be interested in sitting on a wallow if you know it's in that same gully system, because like Ayden was saying, like there is a chance of that stag. I wouldn't say it's like a high chance. Like it might only be like a 10% chance, but I mean, he may come down to that wallow. So that's where if you've got some food and some water in your lunch, I mean, you're probably going to be back up on that ridge anyway in a couple of hours, depending on, what time you got up on the stag to try and hunt him in the arvo when he moves out of that thick bush. But that's where it could be good to just sit on a wallow and sit, 30 meters off it. I mean, you could get anything come in, fox, cat, billy, anything else. But yeah, certainly like you may get that stag in the middle of the day, or you may get another stag in the middle of the day that comes down for a wallow. Late arvos are definitely on dams. Probably my favorite time because I find that hinds or stags, generally speaking, it's very late, like the last 10, 15 minutes of light. Like it's not like I find that they come in at, 2, 3, 4 in the arvo. It's more likely like the last 15 minutes I've had hinds barrel off the side of the mountain and come and swim right in front of me. And most of the time, sadly, you run out of light before the stag gets there and you can hear him calling up on the hill. But, not to say that for you that doesn't work. But another thing with hunting dams, and Ayden sort of touched on the color when you actually see it on the stag, but also looking at the dam. So obviously, the more, because hinds and everything and stags will get into the dam and actually swim and kick up silt and dust and stuff like that. Similarly to a larger volume of like a pig wallow, like the more cloudy and sort of stirred up a dam is, the more activity and normally associated with red deer it is. So, in a drought and stuff like that, cattle can jump into dams and those type of things too. But I've found dams before where you're hunting like a very low density of deer, and you actually rock up and then find a dam that's like really muddy and stuff. And if there's no like pig wallows around it and stuff like that, and no cattle, like I'm going to be very suspicious of red deer, and actually found populations of red deer like that. So looking at the color of the dam to see how like mixed up and stirred up it is may also indicate activity of how much red deer are using it.
Bringing target precision to hunting camp, Option Archery makes specialist gear. Their quiverizer is one of our favourite bits of kit. This stabilizer combined arrow quiver is extremely unique, cutting weight with its clever 2-in-1 design. The Option sights are versatile in this regard also, offering both a single or multi-pin sight housing within the same sight. Shop their products today. I think that sort of wraps up a lot of what we wanted to speak today about in terms of red deer strategies and roaring and things like that. What we might do is move on to our frequently asked questions segment. If anyone has any questions on getting rut ready following this podcast, we obviously touched on the fallow deer last week. So by the time you're hearing this episode, hopefully you've listened to that last one. Send in your fallow questions and we'll try and answer them over the next few weeks. Similarly, if you've got any red stag questions from today's episode, send them in and we'll try and answer them next time. Email those to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject outline FAQ, and we'll answer those as best we can. Or simply send us a DM on Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors on any of our social medias, whether it's Instagram or Facebook. We're most active on Instagram, so that's probably the best one to go to get them answered and on future episodes. This week's question, we actually had one anonymously sent in, or he wanted to remain anonymous. But his question is, I passed up a decent red stag last year. What are the chances that he will return to my block this year? And this one is the age-old question. Like, firstly, I just want to say, congratulations. You've obviously had the restraint to not just shoot that first deer that you see or that red stag. To hear that this hunter has obviously passed up what sounds like a decent stag. He has claimed it as a decent stag and has obviously, similar to someone that's like, growing a garden and putting a crop in, you're putting this investment in and you're hoping that it's getting there next year or that you're going to be able to reap the rewards in the future. So there's a lot of us that with our hunting, once you've taken a few animals or the freezer's full, you do strive for that mature animal. So I think the temptation to shoot that deer was very apparent. They've obviously had the moral thought in their head where they've tossed it up and then decided not to. So unfortunately, there's no definite like guarantee that he'll ever see this deer again. He very well could have passed it up and it roamed, a kilometre or a few hundred metres over the neighbouring fence and been shot that same year. Um, but there is very well a case that that stag could come back. Like they are definitely similar to fallow deer, where we term them as sort of homing pigeons, and we'll go back to that same scrape. To a lesser extent, red stags will definitely go back to that same valley or that same ridge as their first intent. And if there's no hinds there, then they'll obviously move on. But if the hinds are there, then there's a very good chance that that red stag, if he's still alive, will be returning to that area. Now, there are lots of things to consider. Like obviously, he could get shot out of season in velvet. As an animal that's hitting those crops or those blackberry thickets and things like that, just shot by a farmer or someone doing even roo shooters are shooting deer now for venison and things like that. They're obviously getting good prices for it. As well as, there are plenty of farmers out there that just see a big red stag under the spotlight. They're doing pest control for pigs or other animals and they shoot a red stag. So it's not unlikely. But the fact that, you did pass him up, the only way he is going to get bigger and older and more mature is by passing him up. So that's the best chance that you've got of obviously seeing him return. My tip would be try and find the hinds, work out where they are, don't put too much pressure on them, and then, wait for the prime time when the rut and roar comes around in that March, April period, and there's obviously like a chance that he may return.
Yeah, we've certainly, I've been fortunate enough to hunt a few really good blocks with some mates a few years in a row. And that covers quite a vast, we're talking like over 25,000 acres of pretty prime red deer access. And it's been really interesting because of that. We've been able to, year after year, with trial cam photos, and in particular one who we affectionately named the donkey stag, being able to work out that these stags that we, especially younger stags that we're passing up, were going back to pretty much the same spot the next year. So to this listener, I mean, Ayden described like there is so many. The day that you pass him up, he's got to do 360 odd days before you likely see him again to have that same chance. So a lot of things for you can go wrong, and that's where before you decide to pull that trigger, you've got to decide for yourself, I guess, and that depends on your experience and previous hunts and trophies and whatnot, and probably also a little bit where you think that's stag's at with his maturity. Like obviously he might be his best head this year, so next year it may actually go backwards. So there's a lot of factors in deciding to pull the trigger or not pull the trigger. But stags, I would just say my 2 cents, like stags are actually very good, probably better than fallow bucks at sort of hiding away in those deep dark gullies. Like you see a lot more velvet bucks, for example, getting shot on crop or getting shot than I see red stags here in Australia. New Zealand, it may be slightly different, but yeah, certainly probably the biggest sort of downfall of stags really of if they do get shot, it's on when they're on crop by roo shooters or helicopters or something like that. So depending on where you are, how much that takes into play, but they're normally better if you do pass them up. There is a pretty good chance, I'd say, that they're going to make it through to next year. And yeah, I've certainly from experience had them rock up on pretty much the exact same ridge, which is awesome to see. And you get to chase them a year later when they're a bit more mature.
And that's, I think, to sum up this question for this listener, I definitely think you've done the right thing, like to have the foresight and think that, hey, I'm in a position in my hunting where I can pass up this animal. You've obviously gone, like we're all lustful. I see a red stag regardless of how big it is, and I'm like, oh geez, I haven't seen one of these for a while. There's obviously that allure to try and get one on the deck, and then again that your brain takes over, I guess, and you sort of go, if I shoot every single 3-year-old, there's no way they're going to get to a 7-year-old. So just depends what stage of your hunting journey you're on. The fact that you've been able to pass this deer up, and as you said in the first line, is I passed up a decent red stag last year. What are the chances he'll return to my block this year? There is a chance. Whereas if you shot him last year, quite simply, there wouldn't have been a chance. Whether another animal fills that age bracket, I'm sure there will, but they just get so much more thinned out. They're as rare as hen's teeth once they get to that 7, 8, 9, 10 period. And that's obviously sort of what we're striving for. And a lot of these tips and tactics, like what we're directionally talking to you guys about, because if you, and like similar to us, we're always striving to get better and learn more and be able to hunt these most mature animals, because every lesson that we learn in hunting those animals just makes it so much easier to target the younger animals and the more naive animals, especially if we are just on a meat mission. And that's where, you know, it is a bit of a luxury to be able to pass up a red stag, considering that they're a feral animal. And that's where you've also just got to consider, like, this is probably going too far outside of the question. I don't want to like go away from that. But, here in Australia, everything that we're hunting legally is an introduced feral animal. So if your property owner says, hey mate, like I need you to thin out the deer numbers, whether it's a fallow deer during the rut, I would be shooting, the animals that are walking in front of us. If your property owner goes, hey, I actually like the deer, I'm kind of liking that you have a bit of a management strategy with the deer. In most instances, property owners are earning an income from hunting these days. It's going directly back into their pocket or the economy, through, travel expenses, all this gear and stuff that people are buying for their hunts. It's a lifestyle, as we said in so many of these podcasts. Then yeah, a lot of property owners are saying, let's not, shoot everything that walks past. Let's strive for those older animals. So I think you've done the right thing personally. If that's not clear, I'll reiterate that right now. I think, yeah, you've done an awesome job. You're obviously at a stage in your hunting where you're capable of identifying what, a mature animal is and striving for that. So all the best for this coming rut. We obviously want to hear if you're successful and you do, relocate him.
FAQ came in as, what is your favorite style of hunting reds? I'm going to tackle this one because it's probably my favorite hunt, to be honest. This chasing reds and chasing elk, and obviously they're very similar. But so my favorite style is definitely roaring. So I've hunted with people before that would say that I over roar, I guess. So I do, if there's not stags roaring, like I'll roar. But I'm very conservative, as I discussed with the timing and tone part, in terms of like how I roar. So similar to even what we're talking about with rattling and stuff, I'll sort of match the like what I'm seeing and whatnot. So if there's stags roaring, then I'm not roaring at all. But if there's nothing roaring, then I will try and get the party started, as I've sort of said before, with people that I've tried to guide in onto red stags. And then what I'll typically do is I'll cover the ridges, and be moving quite a lot and trying to, roar. And similarly, when I hunt elk, I'll try and bugle to find where a stag may be. And then once I've established where a stag is, and, this all then depends on what time of the morning is, where I think he's like in a thick bit of cover and that's where he's going to stay for the day, or whether I think, he's going to be moving because it's at first light and blah, blah, blah. So you're constantly sort of assessing the situation, assessing what you think the next play is. And that's where you enter that sort of chess game with that stag and maybe the hinds that he's got. So you then locate the stag, and then that's when I sort of go through my gameplay of, what's up my sleeve in terms of like calling. What's mainly like hind calling or fawn calling or roaring. And so that's where generally I'm covering ground, because being a bow hunter, you need to be in quite close to shoot one. And then trying to use one of those tips and tactics, or calling vocalizations to then get him into range. But it's trying to figure out what's going to work. So sometimes, and it really does depend, like sometimes it's a roar. He's going to get that stag to cover the distance and come towards you. Most of the time I've found it's a hind call. But yes, yeah, trying to feel out that trying to feel out that stag and see, what's going to be the most effective way. But I definitely love calling and vocalizing. Like there's not many times, if they're roaring really well and I can, and just do like a pure spot and stalk where I can, get up the mountain and get into position. He's just like keeps roaring, or he's in a spot. But most of the time, by the time you get up there, I find that they're like moving into pretty thick cover. So most of the time you're like trying to draw them to your location a little bit. And for me, that's a hind call.
And that's where, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. There's nothing better than a roaring red stag and that sort of, battle where you're acting on each other's aggression and things like that, and you're getting him closer. When you see a red stag turn and start actively, that's especially those solo red stags start running into your location, whether it be a red stag call or a hind call. It's one of the most exciting things, again, because it's just a massive animal that's enraged and coming in with one clear intent. So we'll go on to our last question, question number 3, and that has been sent in and says, have you tried rattling or raking a tree to attract stags in? To be honest, the way I see this is that, when a stag is super hyped up, particularly, sorry, if he's roaring nonstop, then natural sounds such as like raking a brush or flipping rocks, like you'll see when they're running around chasing the hinds around on a hill face, running through dogwood and stuff, like they're quite loud, like they're often making quite a lot of noise. Um, so those natural sounds will definitely, be part of it. I don't necessarily go out of my way to do it too much, especially because over 100 meters, you're going to be losing that. And then at 50 meters, you've got the risk of it all happens so quickly if you've got an animal coming in that if you're making that extra noise, it's similar to what we spoke about last week on the fallow deer rut tactics podcast, where when you get to a scrape and you touch those antlers together, sometimes you just turn to your left and there's a buck on the scrape already. And if you're sitting there jamming away at these rattles, trying to smash it on a tree, flip rocks and things, you sort of almost become a little bit distracted. Whereas I will say if there's two of you there and you can get someone 20 or 30 meters behind you and you let out a hind call or something like that, and then someone else lets out a roar and then they're smashing a tree, that might pull the stag in for sure because you're painting the picture that there's multiple animals. It's a bit more 3D, like it's layered. Um, and those natural sounds are going to be, almost disguising your actual movement as the shooter who's in front of, the caller. Whereas if it's just you trying to do all those things at once and remain rather stealthy and sort of undetected, it just becomes a lot to sort of achieve in such a short sort of window, especially when you've got an animal coming into your location. But in saying that, we have definitely raked trees and called like big bull elk. Like if you watch that Against All Odds film, we stalked in, or I should say, James had the tag and stalked in on a bull that probably would have gone 380 inches, if not 400. Was absolutely a giant. And that bull we had for probably half an hour just in front of us, bugling off at each other. And we were raking trees. I was running up and down the mountain, smashing trees and limbs and things. Like I couldn't tell you, my hands, I wish I had gloves on because my hands were like cut up from just smashing all these trees and sticks flying and things like that. Like it was almost dangerous, but I was getting full into it. And no matter how much aggression and energy I put into my calling and my bugling and my raking, that bull was doing it tenfold more. So they're definitely vocal and making these natural noises during the roar.
Me and my therapist were just starting to get over that bull. You didn't have to bring him up. Once again, my 2 cents. So I've actually seen, it was one of the most probably coolest things I've seen whilst out hunting. And there was a stag that came in that I passed up because I was trying to get to another stag, more mature stag. Because the first one was beautiful. It was a nice 6x6. I just didn't think he was quite there yet. Passed him up at probably 15, or it was maybe slightly more, maybe 17 meters, as he was thrashing a bush. And then the other stag that we were both trying to get to, I guess, I was just moving in silently and moving between all the hinds and everything like that, actually came over, and on this open bench, these two started. I've never seen anything like it, like just going absolutely wild. And it was, they fought on this open bench for about half an hour until I left them. And the only thing that, it actually hurt was the fact that it was a no moon period. And so it just got quite dark as I was sitting there watching these bulls fight, and I just couldn't get any footage. But the thing is, these bulls were fighting just the pure power and just and then they'd stop fighting and they just and one of the bulls I actually spoke about was the donkey bull from earlier, where he would just sit there and actually scream. And so yeah, that was absolutely awesome to see. But yeah, I've tried it once and had a bull thrash a tree where it wasn't I should say stag. I've had it before where a stag started, I was roaring him in, and he came in. I knew he wasn't very good. And he started raking a tree. So I started raking a tree, and it certainly got him more fired up. It's a tactic I might try this rut probably more, because I know we had a really good success with it in the US, and I can imagine it only would work similarly here with red deer. The only problem that I see is that red deer are a lot sort of quieter in their approach, I guess. Like elk, when a herd of elk are moving through the bush, they're popping limbs and, turning rocks, like what Ayden was saying before when we were trying to get this bull. Whereas red deer, especially when you're roaring, can just miraculously rock up without a word, just, and that's where we probably should say when you're roaring and stuff like that, it's worth having your head on a swivel, because I can't think about how many times a stag's just come in silently and just popped up at 30 or 40 meters. You're like, oh shit. And it can be good stags, bad stags, like just to come and check you out. And so, yeah, it's probably worthwhile if you are in that close 50 meters proximity and you're roaring at a stag. That's where it could be worth getting him to commit and do a bit of, rattling, or not rattling, but I'd certainly rake a tree. It's just that I think it would be a little bit harder than in the US, just because visibility is so much more. So it's just something to consider, because if they see any movement, anything that's sus, I feel like a red stag and red hinds are probably a little bit less forgiving than elk, and so they're more likely to just disappear.
Alrighty, well, sort of coattailing off the back of last week's Fallow Rut podcast and today's Red Raw podcast, hopefully we have you guys covered for the raw and rut that is approaching. Obviously, March is going to be an incredible time of the bush, pushing all the way through till April. So please keep us posted. Please share your images and stories with us as we get into that exciting time of the year. We'd obviously love to share in your successes and lessons learned. And yeah, basically hear from you guys who are our listeners and viewers. For a bit of admin, we're still running a 10K follower giveaway over on our Instagram feed. If you're not already following us on there, please go over and give us a follow. We're literally got the last 50 or so left. And that is to give away $300 worth of venture hunting and outdoors gift vouchers to one lucky winner. That is pinned to our Instagram feed in the top corner of the Instagram on Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, and James Doumtsis Outdoors. All the details on how to enter are over there.
So as you're listening to this, hopefully you've chimed into our YouTube channel and seen the official trailer for our new series that's about to come out, Fallow Frenzy. So as we've discussed previously, Ayden and I followed Nick Morton around the mountains searching for a giant fallow buck. It was an incredible hunt. We learned a lot, but also captured some incredible moments on the side of the mountain. So we've put that together in a 5-piece series. That part 1, which is it's a short ep, and it is a very action-packed ep, drops this Wednesday on the 12th of February. So make sure to check that out. And what we'll be doing is dropping an episode every week from this Wednesday. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube. We're going to have it as a little mini series, and we know you guys are going to love it. It's going to be an action-packed, awesome film.
So yeah, we've obviously got the trailer has just come out. The film part 1 is coming out on the 12th, and then on the 13th of February, so later this week again, we're going to be heading up to Venture Hunting Outdoors Springwood store in Brisbane, Queensland, and hopefully meeting 100 like-minded individuals for their Rut Ready event, which is going to be taking place, as I said, on the 13th of Feb. We're essentially hosting a private meet and greet from 6 p.m. Running through until 9 p.m. as part of this as special sort of feature film. We're going to be screening our Fallow Frenzy videos. It is a 5-part YouTube series, but we've condensed that down to one film, which for those 100 individuals that are attending the evening, they're going to be able to watch it in one sitting. So that's pretty exciting. I'm definitely keen to sit down, relax, hopefully go a beverage and some snacks, which Venture will be shouting us all. They've also got goodie bags and prizes and all those sorts of things. So we'll sit down, relax and watch that. And then once the video screening has been completed, we'll settle into a question and answer where James and I, as well as the Venture crew, will be doing a question and answer segment, answering anyone's queries on the rut, the raw that's approaching, as well as any other just general questions. So make sure that you guys, to register, head to the Venture Hunting Outdoors website. As I said, there's only 100 spots available. It's a completely free event. You've just got to sign up with an email to their VIP service and basically join in on the action.
The next one for the calendar, which we are super excited about, it's going to be a big month, the old February. There's a lot happening here at Twin Elements, but continuing on into March, we've got the Flow State Outdoors Expo. So that is going to be on the Vic, New South Wales border at Wodonga. It's just going to be a one-day event, but it's going to be absolutely action-packed. There's so many vendors that have rocked up now last minute. So it's going to be heaps of outdoor stores that you guys love. So make sure to check them out to get some incredible prices. Ayden and I are going to be there. We're going to have a Twin Elements booth. So make sure to come down and say hello. We're going to be selling some prints of all your favorite photos that we've taken in the last 5 to 10 years. So make sure to come down and grab one of them. But get an early bird ticket now, because another thing that we've teamed up with Flow State to do is give away a $6,000 hunt, our Chiddle hunt at Spotted Safari. So that is only going to be if you've got an early bird ticket. So firstly, if you plan on coming to the event, you have to buy a ticket anyway, so you may as well get it cheaper. But go in the draw to win this hunt. We've also opened it up to the wider audience. So equally, we've sort of said to people, if you want to treat it as a raffle, you can buy a ticket and potentially win this hunt valued at $6,000. It's going to be an epic time. We'll book you in a prime slot, so you guys are going to have an ultimate chance of shooting that Chiddle deer of a lifetime with Ayden and I, and Wade is going to come and film it to make it all that more special for you to look back in the future. So that's only extended to the early bird tickets, so make sure you grab yours today. Equally speaking, later on that night, there is the VIP wild dining experience. So they've got some incredible chefs cooking up some wild game. It's going to be insane. Ayden and I and Dad already have our tickets. There is only 100 spots, so make sure you get in quick. The value of it's $100, which I think is cheap for what they're saying that they're going to be putting up for the night. So make sure to get your ticket today, and we'll see you there.
I'll just touch on it very quickly, but you're going to hear about this over the next few weeks in podcasts, no doubt. But we are nearing 20K subscribers on YouTube. Again, we've had this YouTube in the works from way back in the original days, where you would have seen us as young lads sort of running around the bush shooting at billy goats and feral pigs with our low poundage bows. So we've been there, done it all, and now doing a podcast. We've got a number of incredible brands that are supporting us, and they're trying to support you by giving you guys some awesome prizes and giveaways this year. The first is going to be this 20K subscriber giveaway, where Lower Boots have jumped on board and they're giving away a pair of brand new Ranger GTX3 boots, which we have been using for the last probably 4 or 5 years or so now. Absolutely love them. They've taken us and our feet to places like New Zealand, Montana, and the USA, as well as all over Australia. So they're the first ones to jump in on it. We're going to bulk up that prize pack as we get closer. But if you guys can just make sure that you're subscribing to us on YouTube, sharing the channel with your friends. As I said, Fallow Frenzies just dropped, if you heard what James and I were talking about earlier, as well as we've got a heap of content coming out this year and moving forward. So lastly, we'll just say please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. We obviously thank you very much for your support. On that note, I also just wanted to give a special shout out and thank you to Jack Cullinane, I hope that I've pronounced that correctly, and Ashley Burke. I've seen you guys leaving us some comments on our podcast feed on Spotify, specifically on podcasts on Spotify. You can leave individual comments on every episode. So James and I thank you guys very much from the bottom of our hearts. We greatly appreciate your feedback and really appreciate your support. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Hopefully, again, I've pronounced your names correctly. But if anyone has any comments, questions, anything like that, hit us up on Instagram, send us those FAQs via email, or more specifically, if you're on Spotify listening to us right now, rate, review the podcast, let us know that you're enjoying it, let us know about topics that you want to hear. And from me, thank you very much, legends. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. The amount of support that we're getting around the podcast, we really do appreciate it. Like every time an episode drops, we get 4 or 5 messages just saying how much people are enjoying it, all from a different audience. We're really appreciating all the feedback that we're getting from you guys. A little favor from me, if you guys can, refer a mate or tell a mate, it just helps the community grow. And especially if you enjoyed the last couple of podcasts, like we did jump into a heap of information before, and gave you a full-on rundown on our tips and tactics for hunting fallow deer and red deer. So if you think that you've got a mate that would appreciate and learn from these podcasts, don't keep it to yourself. Make sure you share it with them and get them in on the information, so hopefully they can have a successful rut too. But thank you from the bottom of our heart. We really do appreciate all your support, and we will talk to you next week on the Twin Elements podcast.
See you guys. Have a good one.